the first time a judge had to decide whether I was capable of managing my own life. I was already managing the lives of 19 people who couldn't manage theirs. Every year, that same court trusted me to protect their money, pay their bills, and make decisions no one else was willing to make. Then my parents walked into that courthouse and argued that I was too irresponsible to manage my own inheritance. They even brought evidence they believed would prove it. For a few minutes, it looked like they might actually win. Then their lawyer read one account number out loud. The judge stopped the hearing before another word could be spoken. Security was called. Nobody was allowed to leave the courtroom, because the document my parents thought would take everything from me had just become the evidence. That destroyed their own case. When people hear that my parents tried to convince a judge I was too irresponsible to manage my own inheritance, they usually assume I must have given them a reason. Maybe I had a gambling problem. Maybe I buried myself in debt. Maybe I had a history of reckless decisions that finally caught up with me. The truth was almost impossible to explain, because my entire career depended on doing the exact opposite. I was a licensed professional fiduciary. Every week a judge trusted me with the financial and personal affairs of people who could no longer protect themselves. Some were elderly. Some had suffered traumatic brain injuries. Others simply had no family willing or able to step in. My job was to pay their bills, protect their assets, approve medical expenses, and make sure every dollar was accounted for. Every decision I made could be audited. Every account I managed answered to the court. It was work that demanded precision because one careless mistake could affect someone's entire life. Outside of work, my life was quiet. I lived alone, carried my case files home every evening, and spent most Thursdays visiting one of my longtime wards, an 84-year-old woman named Delphine. She had no close family left, so the court had appointed me to look after her affairs years earlier. She remembered my name on good days and forgot it on others, but she always smiled when I walked into her room. Those visits reminded me why I chose this profession in the first place. Then my grandmother passed away. She left me an inheritance worth about $186,000. It wasn't life-changing wealth. It was the result of decades of careful saving, and I intended to treat it exactly the way she had. I planned to leave the money invested and continue living exactly as I always had. That answer should have ended every conversation about it. Instead, it started one. The first Sunday after the estate closed, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. Before we had even finished eating, my mother asked what I planned to do with the money. I told her I was leaving it where it was. She immediately questioned whether I had spoken with anyone about the decision. I reminded her that I advised people about finances for a living. She barely acknowledged the answer before suggesting my grandmother hadn't been thinking clearly near the end of her life. My father kept his eyes on his plate, while my mother calmly continued the conversation as though she were discussing the weather instead of challenging my grandmother's judgment and my ability to make my own decisions. Looking back, that dinner wasn't really about the inheritance. My mother wasn't asking for my opinion. She was testing whether I would hand over control willingly. When I didn't, she simply moved to another strategy. A few days later, while I was working in my office, a process server walked in and handed me a packet from the court. My parents had filed a petition asking a judge to appoint them as guardians over me. According to the paperwork, I was supposedly incapable of responsibly managing my property, my finances, or the inheritance my grandmother had left behind. They wanted legal authority over my bank accounts, my apartment, my car, and every major financial decision I made. The accusation was almost impossible to process. The same court that trusted me to safeguard vulnerable adults was now being asked to declare that I couldn't safeguard myself. The petition leaned heavily on a brief medical episode from several years earlier. After spending days at the hospital caring for my grandmother with almost no sleep, I had collapsed from exhaustion and been admitted for observation. The records described it as an acute stress reaction brought on by extreme fatigue. My parents transformed that temporary medical event into supposed proof that I was mentally incapable of handling my own affairs. They also described my living alone, working long hours, and even changing my surname as evidence that I was unstable. None of those facts were false. They had simply been stripped of all context until they told an entirely different story. Then came the moment that truly frightened me. When I returned home one evening, something felt wrong. The green accordion folder containing my active client files had been put back together differently. Every file had been rearranged into perfect alphabetical order. Nobody but me would ever organize them that way. I kept them grouped by reporting dates because that was how my workload was structured. The only person outside my office who could have entered the apartment without forcing the door was my father. I had given him a spare key years earlier for emergencies. Standing in that hallway, staring at those neatly reordered files, I realized someone hadn't just entered my home. Someone had gone through confidential records that the court had trusted me to protect. That night, I replaced every lock, photographed everything exactly as I found it, documented every detail, and emailed myself a time-stamped record of the discovery. I didn't know it yet, but those quiet decisions would become the first pieces of evidence in a case my parents never saw coming. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the longest of my life. Every morning I still went to work, met with clients, signed invoices, and filed reports, but every evening ended with another meeting with my attorney, or another stack of court documents waiting on my kitchen table. My parents seemed convinced the petition was only a formality. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. Every filing they submitted painted me as unstable, impulsive, and incapable of handling money, while I answered every allegation with records instead of emotion. The inheritance remained frozen while the court reviewed the petition. But that wasn't what kept me awake at night. What mattered were my clients. If the court suspended my authority, dozens of vulnerable people would suddenly be left without. The person responsible for paying nursing home invoices, approving medical expenses, and keeping their finances in order. I couldn't allow my personal crisis to become theirs. So I worked closely with my employer and the court to ensure every case remained protected. While the legal process unfolded, it wasn't dramatic work. It was simply the responsibility I had accepted the day I entered this profession. At the same time, I couldn't ignore what I had discovered inside my apartment. The reorganized files kept replaying in my mind. Someone had opened confidential records that should never have left my control. Instead of confronting my parents, I documented everything. I photographed the files exactly as I found them, replaced every lock, recorded dates and times, and preserved every email and message connected to the case. My attorney kept reminding me that arguments fade, but documentation survives. If something important had happened inside my apartment, the evidence would eventually reveal it. That became the strange rhythm of those weeks. My parents kept trying to strengthen their case, while I simply continued preserving facts. They gathered witnesses, organized exhibits, and expanded their accusations. I focused on court deadlines, professional obligations, and accurate records. Looking back, neither side realized we were building two very different cases. They were trying to convince the judge I couldn't manage my own affairs. I was unknowingly documenting the chain of events. That explained exactly how their evidence had been assembled. The hearing finally arrived. My parents entered the courtroom looking confident. My mother carried a binder filled with color-coded tabs. My father barely spoke, but he sat beside her with the quiet certainty of someone who expected everything to be over before lunch. Their attorney began presenting the petition exactly as planned, walking through medical records, financial statements, and carefully selected events from my life. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. The judge listened patiently, occasionally asking routine questions while making notes on the file in front of him. Then the attorney introduced the financial exhibits. He explained that the documents demonstrated my supposed inability to manage money responsibly. As he read through account summaries and supporting schedules, he eventually reached a page listing account information that my parents claimed showed a pattern of financial irresponsibility. He read one account number aloud. The judge immediately looked up. He asked the attorney to repeat it. The courtroom fell completely silent. After hearing the number a second time, the judge closed the folder and stared directly at my parents' table. He recognized the account because it didn't belong to me at all. It belonged to one of the protected wards whose guardianship he had personally assigned to my care. That account number existed only inside confidential fiduciary records and sealed court documentation. It had absolutely no legitimate connection to a guardianship petition over my inheritance. The judge asked a simple question. How did this information become part of your evidence? Nobody answered. The attorney looked at my parents. My parents looked at each other. For the first time since the petition had been filed, confidence disappeared from their faces. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He immediately stopped the hearing and instructed everyone to remain seated. Court security was called, not because anyone had become violent, but because the proceedings had suddenly shifted from a disputed guardianship petition to a potential breach involving confidential court-protected records. What had begun as an attempt to control my inheritance had become an entirely different legal matter. Everything after that unfolded with remarkable speed. Investigators traced how the confidential information had entered my parents' possession. The timeline matched exactly what I had documented after discovering my apartment had been searched. The spare key, the reorganized files, the photographs, the time-stamped emails, and every preserved detail suddenly fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. The evidence my parents believed would prove I was irresponsible instead demonstrated unauthorized access to records they were never entitled to possess. The guardianship petition collapsed almost immediately. Separate investigations followed. My mother ultimately faced criminal consequences for her role in obtaining and using confidential fiduciary information, while my father was also held legally accountable for his participation. Their effort to seize control of my inheritance ended with neither the inheritance nor the authority they had sought. The hardest decision, however, was still mine. Although I had done nothing to authorize the breach, confidential client information had been accessed while under my responsibility. I reported the incident to the appropriate compliance authorities myself before anyone required me to do so. That decision triggered professional reviews and ultimately ended the career I had spent years building. It was devastating, but protecting the integrity of the people I had been trusted to serve mattered more than protecting my title. If I expected others to respect the rules that safeguarded vulnerable people, I had to accept those same standards myself. Years later, I no longer work as a professional fiduciary. Instead, I help families understand guardianship proceedings and advocate for people navigating systems. That can feel overwhelming when used honestly and terrifying when abused. I never recovered the career I lost, but I kept something far more valuable. My integrity survived intact. In the end, my parents believed they could manipulate a legal system built on documentation. They forgot one simple truth. Courts may listen to stories, but they decide cases using evidence. And sometimes the most damaging evidence is the evidence you bring against yourself.